The Empire issued its final ultimatum to Earth. 6 hours later, no one spoke for them. The chamber at Conclave Nexus Velketh was designed so that whoever speaks at the center must look up. Executor Navin Torin never looked up. He stood at the crescent table, his 8'7" frame draped in ceremonial robes that carried 47 conquest seals along the spine ridge. His carapace was obsidian dark, buffed to a shine that reflected the chamber lights in precise angles. 3 fingers on each hand, each tipped with calcite that clicked softly when he moved. His thin lips parted just enough to let sound through. The voice that had ended 7 previous confrontations without requiring a second sentence. 6 hours, he said. You will transfer your fleet from Jericho Point to neutral holding. You will surrender 7 orbital installations to Dominion custody. You will withdraw your seat from this council. 6 hours to comply, or the 22,000 vessels waiting at your border will provide clarification. He waited 3 seconds. His staff called it the measure, the pause that said his decision had already been made, and everyone in the chamber knew it. The 12 co-signatory species of the Kelthari Dominion's defensive alliance leaned forward in their seats. One by one, they moved to the registry wall behind the crescent table and pressed their delegation seals to the warm stone. The seals glowed a deep red as they affirmed the ultimatum. Admiral Kes Vrance did not move. She sat in the human delegation's chair, the only seat that faced the chamber directly instead of bowing to the crescent's hierarchy. Her uniform was plain gray with no insignia except a single patch, a circle bisected by a line, meant to signify something about humanity that the Dominion had never bothered to ask. She was human, which meant soft-bodied, bipedal, short-lived by the standards of species that measured years in thousands. She was a fleet commander, which meant she had authority over 847 vessels, a number that looked almost comical next to the 22,000 waiting at the border. Her hands rested on the table's edge. They did not shake, her eyes did not shift. Torin glanced at her. Not a full look. He never offered full looks to species beneath his hierarchy, but a sideways acknowledgement that she had been noticed and found insignificant. Then he turned away and began to leave the chamber. That was when Vane Os, sitting in the diplomatic gallery above the crescent table, felt the first cold thought. He did not ask for a response. In 39 years of attending councils, Vane had never witnessed an ultimatum delivered without demanding immediate compliance or defiance. Torin had simply stated the terms and begun to walk. The 12 co-signatories had affirmed. The human had sat in stillness. And Executor Navin Torin was leaving as though the outcome had already been written into fact. Vane's fingers moved instinctively across the tablet in her lap, pulling up the transcript of Torin's words. Standard Dominion phrasing, quantified demand, precise timeline. She had filed 41 reports over 11 years that used almost identical language to describe human military reduction, human compliance, human acceptance of diminished standing in the Galactic Federation. But Vrance had not accepted. Vrance had simply sat still and let the silence do the work. Vane closed the transcript and looked at the human delegation again. Vrance's eyes were fixed on the wall behind Torin's empty seat, the registry wall, where the 12 co-signatory seals burned red in the warm stone. One set of them belonged to the Thyran, aquatic and gill-dependent, whose water processing systems had been failing since their colony's aquifer collapsed 4 years ago. One set belonged to Sorrel IV, whose agricultural sector had faced famine twice in the past decade. 3 sets belonged to peripheral colonies, whose medical infrastructure was so fragile that a single supply chain disruption could cost thousands. All 12 had affirmed the ultimatum, without hesitation. All 12 would be destroyed if they tried to stand against a 22,000-vessel armada. Yet Vrance sat as though she had already calculated a problem that Vane could not see. She's going to request archive access, Vane said quietly, more to herself than to the attaché sitting next to her. Something about this doesn't align. But Vrance did not move. The chamber doors sealed behind Torin. The 12 co-signatories filed out in order of hierarchy, their seals still glowing red on the wall. The human delegation remained alone in the crescent table, and Vrance did not move, and Vane felt the first genuine uncertainty she had experienced in her careful career, the feeling that a report she had filed, something she had written as fact, was about to be unmade. The archive beneath Conclave Nexus Velketh occupied 3 sublevel chambers. Its walls were lined with storage systems that hummed a constant, gentle frequency, the sound of billions of records being held in stasis, preserved against the possibility that someone might need to know what had actually happened, not what had been agreed to officially. Vane descended alone. Her credentials as a Kael'thari third-rank attaché gave her access to most of the archive, though certain sections required clearance she did not possess. The diplomatic records, however, were open. 11 years of human dominion correspondence, 11 years of trade manifests, resource transfers, fleet movement logs, and compliance certifications. She pulled up the first year's file. The language was consistent. Human demilitarization ongoing, trade activity shifted to agriculture and medicine, no escalatory indicators. Accord appears accepted without formal resistance. The second year, freight manifests confirm ongoing reduction, trade activity expanded to medical infrastructure transfer, human posture defensive and diminishing. Year 4, the pattern held. No anomalies. Year 9, the accord appears accepted without formal resistance. Every report had been technically accurate. Every data point was sound. What they did not show was the arithmetic beneath, the shape of what a species gives when it is not preparing a fleet. Vane's hands stilled over the terminal. She had written most of these reports. She had cited the manifests, verified the compliance, confirmed the reduction. She had been correct, and she had been missing something so obvious that it was only visible when you read all 11 years at once. The Thyran had received water processing schematics. The Sorrel had received emergency grain protocols. The medical colonies had received infrastructure designs. All of it was filed as humanitarian assistance. No contracts, no leverage, no conditions. The Dominion had dismissed it as the final gasp of a diminishing species trying to purchase goodwill before inevitable absorption. But the Dominion had been wrong about the timing. It had not been happening over 11 years. It had been accelerating. Vane pulled the summary file and began to cross-reference. Thyran water processing, delivered in 2 phases, the critical second phase arriving 43 hours before the Dominion's own promised aid arrived. Sorrel grain protocols. The timing was there, archived without interpretation. Medical networks to the peripheral colonies. They were operational now, functioning, dependent, and entirely designed by human engineers who had refused payment or contract terms. What the manifest showed, when read together, was the shape of a species preparing not a fleet, but an alliance. Vane sat back from the terminal. Around her, the archive hummed its constant frequency. Somewhere above, in the chamber at the crescent table, 6 hours were beginning to count down toward either humanity's surrender or the galaxy's first kinetic war in 300 years. She thought of Executor Torren's measured pause before leaving the chamber. She thought of Admiral Vrance sitting in absolute stillness, while the 12 co-signatories affirmed their loyalty to the Dominion's ultimatum. She thought of the 41 reports she had filed, each one accurate, each one incomplete, and she reached for the access terminal to pull the full, unredacted aid records from every year, not the summaries, not the manifests that had been filed with routine approval, the complete documentation of what had been given, to whom, in what quantities, at what precise moment in the timeline, because Vane had begun to understand something that Executor Navin Torren, who had never looked up in his life, had failed to see coming. The clock that was counting down was not the one measuring the 6 hours. The files populated across her screen like frost forming on glass. Year 1, Thyran Water Processing Design Package. Schematics for reverse osmosis towers, mineral separation matrices, the complete architecture of a system that could turn salt into resource. Attached. No contract required. Implementation support available upon request. Estimated installation, 90 days. The Dominion's response, filed 6 months later, was a single line in the diplomatic record, noted, Assistance appreciated. Kelthari water reserves adequate for defensive zone. Vane scrolled to the next file. Year 3. Sorrel IV famine protocols. Crop rotation matrices. Seed storage designs. Emergency grain transport agreements with 3 independent merchant collectives. The manifests showed human agricultural engineers arriving with equipment, establishing systems, training local coordinators, and departing without filing a single cost assessment or leverage clause. Sorrel IV's formal acknowledgement. The assistance is received with gratitude. The Kelthari remain committed to mutual defense. Year 5. The medical networks began. 3 peripheral colonies, each facing population collapse from disease vectors that their indigenous medical systems could not process. Humanity sent not treatment but infrastructure. Design specifications for filtration systems, immunological scanners, pharmaceutical synthesis matrices, fully operational within 4 months. 0 cost, 0 debt. The colony's co-signatory seals were renewed on the Dominion's roster without comment. Vane's fingers moved faster now, pulling cross-references. The pattern was not hidden. It was simply so distributed across 11 years of routine filings that no single reader would see it as a shape. But read together, from year 1 to year 11, it was unmistakable. Every species that had just affirmed Torrens' ultimatum had received something from humanity that they could not live without. The Thyron's aquifer had collapsed. Humanity gave them water. The Sorrel had faced starvation twice. Humanity gave them food. The peripheral colonies had been dying. Humanity gave them medicine, not as leverage, not as a bargaining position to be cashed in later. The documentation was clear, given freely, maintained without contract, renewed without conditions. The Dominion had permitted it because the Dominion saw it as a species in decline, attempting to purchase goodwill as it prepared for inevitable extinction. The Dominion had misread the timeline. Vane pulled up the latest manifests. The water processors in Thyron Station were running at optimal capacity. The grain stores on Sorrel IV were full. The medical networks across the 3 peripheral colonies were reporting 0 operational failures. All of it was functional. All of it was dependent. All of it was human-designed and human-maintained. And according to the registry record, not a single Dominion installation had ever been asked to maintain any of it. The thought arrived like cold water. They cannot remove what they never provided. Vane stood up from the terminal. The archive hummed around her. She had pulled the files in isolation, as a routine check, following the threads of one small curiosity about why Admiral Vrance had not reacted to the ultimatum. But now she understood that the question was not whether Vrance would surrender. The question was why Torren had believed she would. The Dominion structure was built on the assumption that power flowed downward through hierarchy. Lesser species accepted terms. Species with fewer vessels capitulated without negotiation. Admiral Kess Vrance, commanding 847 vessels and leading a species that the Dominion had watched diminish for 11 years, should have fallen into the familiar shape of that hierarchy. Instead, she had sat in stillness. Vane moved toward the archive's central terminal, the one that connected directly to the Council's internal communication network. Her credentials would allow her to access the diplomatic protocols. Her rank would permit her to file an updated assessment. Her status as a Kelthari third-rank attaché meant that anything she flagged would reach the intelligence directorate within minutes. But what would she file? That the human species had secretly strengthened 14 other species over 11 years. That the ultimatum might be founded on a catastrophic misreading of the current strategic environment. That the Dominion had been wrong. She stopped walking. Her fingers hesitated over the terminal's access panel. The archive was silent except for the constant hum of the preservation systems. No one else was present. No one would know if she filed a report or did not file a report. No one would know if she simply erased the discovery and returned to the chamber to watch Torren's certainty play out to its conclusion. Except she would know. Vane's hand moved to the terminal. She began to pull up the Clause 7 protocol, the standing order that required simultaneous disclosure of corrected intelligence assessment to all affected parties. She had cited it 41 times in her career, each citation routine, each one filed without ever understanding why it existed. Now she understood. It existed so that no single party could be left exposed by another's silence. It existed so that when one attaché figured out that the Dominion's assumptions were collapsing, she was obligated to tell all the other species at the same moment, in the same way, with the same documentation. It existed to prevent individual hesitation from becoming unified paralysis. Vane began to compile the dossier, every aid manifest, every transfer record, every timestamp that showed which species had received what in what year with what degree of dependency. She worked for 47 minutes without stopping. The archive hummed. The clock in the corner of the terminal counted down toward the 6-hour deadline, now at 5 hours and 12 minutes remaining. When the compilation was complete, she sent it to the Council communication system with the Clause 7 flag attached. The flag meant simultaneous distribution to all 14 co-signatory delegations. The flag meant no single species would receive the information before another. The flag meant that 14 groups of intelligent beings would, at the exact same moment, look at the same document and arrive at the same understanding. The flag meant that Torrens' ultimatum had just become history instead of future. Vane pressed the transmission key. The file was gone from her terminal, not deleted, but routed to the concurrent distribution queue. Within seconds, it would land in the secure inboxes of 14 delegations. Within minutes, the verification would begin. Within an hour, the dread would arrive. She stood in the archive and understood, for the first time in her career, why the Dominion had built Clause 7 into its protocols at all. It was a safety mechanism. It was also, right now, the mechanism by which the Dominion's certainty would shatter. The registry wall at Conclave Nexus Velketh would begin to show the consequences within 90 minutes. The seals would cool. The red warmth would fade to gray. And Executor Navin Torren, who had never looked up in his life, would finally have reason to do so. Because when 14 species discovered at the same moment that they owed their survival to the species Torren was demanding they help destroy, the measure, that 3-second pause of absolute certainty, would no longer have any meaning. There would be no verdict left to signal. The verification took 90 minutes. Thyran delegation lead Asara cross-referenced her own infrastructure logs first, fingers trembling across the terminal as she pulled up the water processor schematics. The timestamp was from year 3, the Dominion's own convoy, the one she had thanked in the ceremonial chamber, the one she had celebrated as the Alliance's proof of commitment, had arrived 43 hours later. The permanent registry showed both entries. Both were factual. One had simply come first. She pulled up the medical network logs next. Peripheral colonies were reporting the same thing. Human-designed systems, currently operational, zero dependency on Dominion infrastructure. The famine relief to Sorrel IV had a timestamp. The Dominion's slower convoy had a different timestamp. Everything was accurate. Everything was archived. What the archival record showed, read in sequence, was the shape of a species that had loved the galaxy long before it had been asked to die for it. Asara sent a priority flag to her delegation lead. 2 other peripheral colonies sent the same flag within minutes. By the time the 84th minute had passed, all 14 co-signatories had verified the same document, cross-referenced the same timestamps, and reached the same arithmetic. The wall at Conclave Nexus Velketh was about to change color. Torren's office occupied the highest tier of the Dominion's administrative wing. From the crescent windows, he could see the registry wall, a massive stone structure carved into the chamber's central spine, embedded with thousands of warm seals that glowed red when active, cooled to gray when withdrawn or dormant. The seals were the backbone of the Dominion's power structure. They meant commitment. They meant loyalty. They meant that the species bearing those seals had pledged themselves to the Dominion's cause and would not break that pledge without extreme consequence. He stood at the window. The seals were still warm, red, affirming his ultimatum. His chief of staff, Kaelver, entered without announcement, a privilege of rank that meant the news was catastrophic. The Keith network has gone dark, Kaelver said. The Keith were a peripheral species. their entire medical infrastructure dependent on a Dominion-provided supply chain. Except, according to the file Culver was now displaying on Torin's personal terminal, the Keith network had never been Dominion-provided. It had been human-provided, installed without contract, maintained without leverage, and now apparently fully functional without a single Dominion component. The water processors at Thyron Station are human-built, Culver continued. The famine relief on Sorrel IV arrived before ours did, by 43 hours. This is documented in the registry. Torin did not move. He was still looking at the wall, at the red seals, at the warmth that signified certainty. How many? He asked. All of them, Culver said. Every species that affirmed the ultimatum just discovered that they owe their survival to the human compact. Every single one. The first seal went gray at minute 87. Not withdrawn, not formally rescinded, simply no longer warm. The delegation had stopped affirming the ultimatum. They had not declared allegiance to humanity. They had simply chosen not to participate in humanity's destruction. By minute 90, 6 seals had cooled. By minute 92, the registry wall showed a pattern that Torin had never witnessed. Simultaneous hesitation from species that should have been locked in hierarchy, unable to move without permission, incapable of independent action. They had moved in perfect synchronization, which meant they had not been independent at all. They had been given the same information at the same moment and had reached the same conclusion with astronomical precision. Someone had orchestrated this. Someone had seen the weakness in his structure and had used his own protocols against him. Find Vane Os, Torin said. His voice had dropped an octave, the tone he used when giving orders that would end careers. Find out what she filed. Culver was already moving toward the communication terminal, but the message was arriving at the same moment. A priority flag from the Intelligence Directorate. A Clause 7 disclosure filed by third-rank attaché Vane Os, distributed simultaneously to all 14 co-signatory delegations. The complete aid documentation, the timeline, the arithmetic that showed which species had been given what, in what year, by a species that the Dominion had assessed as diminishing. Torin did not apply the measure. The 3-second pause that had preceded his verdicts had no purpose now. There was no verdict to signal. The outcome was already moving without waiting for his certainty. He looked at the registry wall, where 8 seals were now gray. Somewhere on the other side of the planet, at Conclave Nexus Velketh's transmission hub, Admiral Kes Vrance was already moving. Torin did not know this yet. He would not know it for another 7 minutes, when his staff informed him that the human delegation had opened an emergency channel to the Council, that evacuation corridors had been filed in the registry, and that the coordinates were live. But in the moment of silence that followed the verification cascade, when Torin finally looked away from the wall and understood that his structure had not been breached by force but by the simple act of simultaneous truth-telling, he felt something that his carapace was not designed to express. The cold realization that patience, when turned against you, was not weakness. It was the most dangerous weapon in the galaxy. Admiral Kes Vrance sat alone in the transmission chamber. The console in front of her displayed the registry updates in real time. 6 seals cooled, 8 seals cooled. The delegations were verifying, cross-referencing, and arriving at the same conclusion without needing to speak to one another. This was why she had sat in stillness during the ultimatum. This was why her hands had not shaken. This was why Torin had looked at her with contempt, because she had already calculated the outcome 4 hours earlier, when Vane Os had sent the first secure message to Admiral Vrance's private terminal. The message had been 3 lines. I have discovered the pattern. Clause 7 requires disclosure. If I file, all 14 will know simultaneously. Vrance had sent back one word, file. Now, as the 8th seal turned gray on the registry wall, Vrance opened every frequency. The council-wide channel, the diplomatic network, the emergency cascade that would reach 14 delegations at the same moment, in the same voice, with the same coordinates. She did not pause. She read the evacuation corridor locations. 40 minutes for every Kelthari civilian to clear the designated lanes, because the plan had never included harm to the helpless. Because humanity, which the Dominion had seen as diminishing, had spent 11 years building toward a moment where it would prove, with absolute precision, what it did not do. Then she spoke the line that would echo through every recording, every archive, every permanent registry for the rest of the galactic age. You had 6 hours. We had 11 years. The clock was never the one you were watching. She cut the transmission. In the silence that followed, somewhere in the Dominion's command structure, Executor Navin Torin heard the words and understood that his greatest mistake was assuming that patience looked like surrender. The registry wall at Conclave Nexus Velketh showed 10 seals cooled to gray. Within seconds, the update came: 14 species, moving independently to defensive positions. The evacuation corridors were clear. The 22,000-vessel Kelthari Armada, which had been waiting for an order that would never come, encountered the coalition at Jericho Point. 9 of the 12 fleet groups discovered they had standing treaties, with species now positioned on the other side of the confrontation line. 3 fleet groups engaged. They were contained in 89 minutes. The 81 installations went dark one by one. Drive Forge at Sector 7. Timestamp logged 1847-32. Status dormant. Civilian corridors confirmed clear. Kelthari personnel evacuated per emergency protocol. Registry entry permanent and public. Arsenal complex forward position 12. Timestamp logged 1903-14. Status offline. Registry entry permanent and public. The dismantling was not rapid. It was methodical. Each installation was a city unto itself, a manufacturing plant, a shipyard, a munitions depot. To dismantle one took hours. But the Dominion had not sent only 3 fleet groups to Jericho Point. They had sent 22,000 vessels. And now, as the 9 fleet groups that had stood down began to move into position around the installations, the dismantling became possible. One by one, each logged, each permanent. The registry wall at Conclave Nexus Velketh updated in real time. The council members watched entries accumulate. The documentation was flawless. Timestamps, coordinates, confirmation that no populated corridor had been breached, that no Kelthari wounded had been left unprocessed, that the destruction was absolute and the restraint was equally absolute. This was what surprised the Dominion most. Not that they were losing, but that they were losing while being documented with perfect clarity. Every installation dismantled was recorded. Every civilian safe was noted. Every human restraint was witnessed. The permanent record would show, for eternity, that humanity had destroyed the Kelthari Dominion's military infrastructure without destroying a single Kelthari person. Executor Navin Torin sat in his office and watched the registry updates arrive. His staff stood at attention around him, waiting for orders. There were no orders to give. The structure had broken. The hierarchy had collapsed. The 12 co-signatory species were no longer affirming his authority. 9 of his own fleet groups had declined to engage. 3 had tried and been contained. And now, installation by installation, the foundation of his military might was being erased from the galaxy. He did not apply the measure. The 3-second pause that had preceded every verdict he had ever issued had no purpose now. There was no verdict to signal. There was only the silence of watching an empire end, not in fire but in precise, documented fact. His aide Calver approached with a secure message. The message was from Admiral Kes Vrance. 1 sentence. When the last installation falls, the permanent record closes. After that, we talk about what comes next. Torin did not respond. He simply watched the registry wall, where installation 63 went dark at 22:14:47. Vane Os remained in the archive. She had not left since sending the Clause 7 transmission. The terminal in front of her displayed the real-time registry updates. Every entry was a confirmation that her analysis had been correct, that the Dominion's assumptions had been catastrophically wrong, that the species it had dismissed as diminishing had spent 11 years building toward this moment. She pulled up her original report from Year 1, the first assessment she had filed on humanity. The human military posture is defensive and diminishing. Low priority, ongoing monitoring recommended. She began to write her final assessment. It was the longest document she had ever compiled, 47,000 characters of archive cross-reference, timeline analysis, and institutional consequence. She wrote about the water processors, the famine relief, the medical networks. She wrote about the moment Torin had issued his ultimatum without asking for a response. She wrote about the silence that had followed, and she wrote about the 11 years. The human species did not prepare a fleet, she concluded. It prepared an alliance. It gave without leverage. It built the foundation for something larger than itself, and it waited for the moment when the Dominion's assumptions would become liability. She filed the report with the permanent archive. The status would not change it. This was a Kelthari Attaché's honest assessment, filed for the historical record. It would sit in the archive for eternity. Future delegations would read it. Future councils would understand from this single document why the empire had fallen. Installation 78 went dark at 23:59:04. The last installation, the shipyard at Forward Position 1, where the Dominion had constructed its largest vessels, fell at 04:18:17, exactly 4 hours and 18 minutes after Vrance had cut the transmission. The registry wall updated one final time. Installation 81 dormant, status permanent, civilian corridors clear, personnel safe, restraint documented. Then the permanent record closed. The silence that followed was absolute. The council chamber reconvened at dawn. The 14 delegations filed in and took their seats. Executor Navin Torin sat at the crescent table, alone. No staff attended him. No co-signatory species affirmed his presence. He simply sat and waited for the next step in a process he could no longer control. The delegations, working in parallel since the defection, had prepared 14 simultaneous recognition filings. They arrived on the council registry at the exact same moment, as if by coordination, though no coordination had taken place. Each filing was identical in structure. Each citation was the same. They recognized humanity's full standing in the Galactic Council. They honored the restraint documented in the permanent registry. They committed to the defense of species that did not dominate them, that had only given. The evidence was not argument. The evidence was document. The evidence was the permanent record which would not lie and could not be erased. Torin did not leave the chamber. He could not. The protocol required that he remain until the council was dismissed. So he sat in the silence and understood, with the precision of someone whose entire life had been built on understanding hierarchy, that the hierarchy had shifted beneath him. He was no longer at the apex. He was at the periphery. 14 species had looked at the same evidence at the same moment and had arrived at the same verdict, and there was no power he possessed that could overturn a verdict that had been reached by unanimous choice, not by command. A clerk entered the chamber with a document. The clerk was young, Kelthari, trained in the formal protocols of the council. She carried a sealed file. She approached the crescent table and placed it before Torin. "The formal accounting of casualties," she said, "to be read into the permanent record as per council protocol." Torin opened the file. The casualties were not from the fleet engagement. The fleet engagement had resulted in 3 destroyed vessels and no loss of Kelthari personnel. The containment had been precise. The casualties listed in the file were the dead from the Dominion's expansion into the galaxy, the humans whose settlements had been erased without filing, whose histories had been removed from the record, whose existence had been deemed insignificant enough to delete. 47 minutes of names. The clerk began to read them aloud. Each name was added to the permanent registry as she spoke. Each entry was time-stamped. Each person, previously erased, was now immortal in the record. Torin sat in silence and listened to the names of the dead become fact. By the time the last name was recorded, the sun had set. The council chamber was silent except for the sound of the registry wall as it updated one final time. The permanent record now held not only the documentation of humanity's restraint, but the names of those who had taught humanity what restraint meant. Torin did not apply the measure. The 3-second pause was no longer his to command. It belonged to 14 species who had already looked at the evidence and made their choice. It belonged to the dead whose names were now being preserved forever. It belonged to the future that would read this record and know the difference between surrender and preparation, between weakness and the patience of someone who knew the clock was never the one the enemy was watching. He stood and left the chamber. No one watched him leave. The council had moved on to the business of restructuring the alliance, of reintegrating the 14 species into a new formation where no single power could assume dominance, where truth could be documented and witnessed by all simultaneously. As he walked through the corridors of Conclave Nexus Velketh, Torin heard the final entry being added to the registry. The names of the 47,000 human dead read into the permanent record, impossible to erase, impossible to ignore, impossible to deny. The silence belonged to 14 species now, and it would forever.